Good morning, everyone. It is still morning. It's 11 o'clock on the East Coast. Good morning. Happy Monday. Happy MLK Day. I am so glad that those of you who are joining us today are able to join us and have the time, hopefully away from work, to do it. I'm really excited about this conversation. Before we get started, as you're coming into the show, would you please like this broadcast, share it out with other friends who would be interested in this topic, and consider subscribing to the channel if you are not already subscribed. I cover topics relating to education in America here, and just getting so many great guests like today's guest. So today I have Dr. Sheena Mason with us, and she is the co-founder of Theory of Racelessness. And I'm just so excited for her to talk to us about what that means. But real quick, as a brief intro, this past May, she earned her Ph.D. with distinction from Howard University in Washington. And she has a book coming out called Decolonizing the Racialist Imagination in Literary Studies, an interrogation and critique of anti-racist discourse. And so what she is going to talk to us today about is her organization, Theory of Racelessness, what that means. She's going to talk to us hopefully about her work, her scholarly work, and what she learned and what she observed. And then as I have questions, or as you have questions, please post them to the chat and we'll see if we can get those answered. But I'm just really excited to talk to Sheena. I've been following her Twitter feed and seeing some of the things that she's been talking about. And I just want to learn. So today is a learning exercise for me and hopefully for my audience. Welcome, Sheena. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Deb. I'm excited.
Thank you for coming. So tell us about your work. Like, tell us, what I'm really curious about is, first of all, what got you interested in this in the first place? Like, what was the impetus for this scholarly journey of yours?
So my doctorate is in English literature. I specialize in African American, Caribbean, and American literature. And for as long as I can remember, I've always been extremely focused and interested in understanding how race gets essentialized in American society. And as a result of that, even as an undergraduate, I did something called an advanced honors thesis. It was a 100-page, 2-year-long research project where I focused on examining the history of African American literary studies. And because that body of work has been defined as a priori race and racism, I was inevitably always researching the genealogy of race, the history of racism, all of the things that influence and inform that particular literature. So my doctorate journey was a continuation really of my undergraduate and my master's work, where I was really interested in deep diving and understanding what is going on here and finding a way to put language to some ideas and feelings I had about race and racism in American society, but didn't necessarily have the language to. And even still, it's a continued journey. I don't pretend that I have all of the answers yet, but my work is timely as I see it because I graduated right around when the thing being called CRT started blowing up in the social, political, and cultural arena. And I saw an opportunity to take some of my learnings and my signature theory, which is the theory of racelessness, and apply it in ways that I only imagined possible. Because I understand the history and the genealogy of race and racism, I see an opportunity to do good work and to finally help people transcend both.
Right. Now, this fascinates me. You talk about the genealogy and the history of racism. Is there a different one for America versus the rest of the world?
Yes.
There is. Can you help us understand that, like how that is and possibly why that is? I mean, it obviously would be like a college class, but if you could like maybe like summarize it a little bit, like what your core finding, I guess, would be.
Sure. And I love college classes. I'm an assistant professor too, so it makes
Right. So I'm like,
makes
but I
perfect
know we
sense.
don't have time for you to teach us the whole semester of class, but summary, like, how are we different? Why are we, because
Sure.
we do hear that a lot. We hear it's like, this is unique to America or that's unique to America. And as I mentioned to you before the show, there's certain things I hear people say. I'm like, well, I don't think they're completely wrong, but at the same time, I don't really understand how to explain what parts are right and what parts are not right. Right. So like,
Yeah.
how are we different?
I think part of the problem of the discourse around racism is this idea that it's everywhere. It's omnipresent, it's global. This thing called white supremacy is global, anti-blackness is global. I think that's actually to the detriment of our ability to grapple with what racism is and what it's not. And it also impedes our ability to transcend the thing because after all, if it's godlike, if it's everywhere and it's inescapable, then we can't escape it, right? Because it's literally everywhere.
Right.
So I part of my interest is helping people relativize how they conceive of race and racism by exploring race and racism in other countries. And you have an entire discipline of philosophy called philosophy of race, where they examine, does capital R race travel? And the general consensus by many philosophers who study philosophies of race say that it does not travel. But that is not to say that there isn't a practice of othering, subjugating, oppressing people in other communities. It just looks different. And I think that the difference matters, and we needn't just automatically label everything racism, because I don't think that's what's happening. So, for example, if we look at France, you have people like James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Barbara Chase Rabeau, who currently lives there, who flee to France because they're trying to escape American racism. And they prefer France because the French are not obsessed with race and color in the ways that Americans are. That is not to say that the French are perfect. That is not to say that they don't have other forms of discrimination. But if I go to France, I will be looked at as an American. I won't be looked at as a hyphenated, Black or African American or Black. I would be looked at as American. And that affords me certain amounts of privilege in different European countries, in many
Right.
countries across the world, actually. But on the same token, somebody from Ethiopia or somebody from Nigeria might immigrate to a place like France and experience discrimination. So, my question for my students, which I guess today is the audience, uh, is that racism, right? If I can go there, or if picture somebody with a darker complexion, because some people might say, well, it's because you have fair skin. Okay, picture somebody else with a darker complexion. It just,
Well, James Baldwin was darker, right?
there
So
it is. James
yeah,
Baldwin, Toni Morrison, probably
right.
definitely darker than I am. If they go there and they are not racialized, meaning they are not demarcated as Black, and the synonym for that would be African American, and they're just viewed as American, and they receive privileges as being Americans, and they're treated with that privilege. But somebody from the continent of Africa goes there and they experience discrimination. Is that racism? And it's a leading question, because I conclude that it's not racism. It's xenophobia, right? It's something else is in the water, some form of
Right.
nationalism. And and this is true if we go to places like Jamaica or Nigeria. There are different class and caste systems there. Certainly, a place like Jamaica has the tenuous history of slavery there, but you have people immigrating from Jamaican society to the US and speaking out against how they're racialized, because in Jamaica, to them, Black means primarily it's a descriptor, it's a matter of fact, it's obvious, right? You can look at a person and they're Black, but that doesn't mean anything culturally. It doesn't mean anything politically. It doesn't mean anything else other than essentially ancestry and DNA and how a person presents. In the United States, that meaning, that same word concept gets conflated with literally everything under the sun to mean so much more than it means for people racialized as Black in other countries. In Nigeria, it's even more complex, because you have a concept of race and racialization, but essentially anyone coming from overseas to get to the continent of Africa is considered white. So everyone, I would be white there, James Baldwin would be considered white there. And there's no value or hierarchy necessarily attached to that perceived whiteness. It's just the way they conceive of race in Nigeria, according to many Nigerians that I've had the pleasure of speaking with. And so it is different. I think where people get tripped up is, in addition to proclaiming that racism is everywhere, some other people get tripped up in feeling like America's soul or ethics or morality are being attacked when somebody like myself comes along and says it is unique to America, right?
But lots of things are unique to America. We're a pretty unique place. So
Yeah,
it's really not
uniqueness.
that surprising that this would be different as well. I think people hear different and they hear worse.
Right.
And there are those people, obviously, who are saying that in plain English. They're saying different and worse. But
Yes.
not everyone is saying different and worse. And that's, like I said, where I get tripped up, where I'm like, well, they're not factually incorrect. It's just the framing, right? So, like, I'm kind of taking issue with the framing, but the fact is the fact. Like, facts are facts, right? As you just pointed out.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I think that's critical to being able to have more generative dialogue about something like racism. And for me, the sort of moral suasion that generally comes around all of this is on the back burner. I don't view people as being morally corrupt if they have racist ideas or racist beliefs, and I view racism as being something that more people than not uphold in American society, which differs from the general understanding of racism as well. But the good news is, I also believe that it's something we can overcome.
Great. So maybe you could explain a little bit about the specific American genealogy of it, or kind of like what you have seen in your studies. I know that some people have said it's all tied up in slavery. It's 100% tied up in slavery. It's one, or it, everything that came after, Jim Crow, et cetera. I mean, I imagine there's certainly some truth to that. But when we look at, for example, the Caribbean, and you mentioned Jamaica, and if we look at even South America, Brazil, et cetera, if we look at the sheer numbers of African slaves and the sheer volume of the slave trade that went on in places other than America, as in the colonies, right? There was a higher volume, longer period of time, all kinds of things. So it didn't really, like, there's got to be something else. There has to be something else other than just the fact of chattel slavery. There has to have been some other cultural, political, social component to it, or not. I don't know. See, this has been always my question. Like, could it only be that? I don't think it can only be that. But
Yeah, so the word race and the concept of race comes from early modern Europe. And during those centuries, it was a differentiation. There was a hierarchy attached to it, but it was more based along ethnicity and nationality. And so it makes sense actually that many European countries, if not most, have conceptions of ethnicity and nationality, whereas they don't have necessarily conceptions of racialization that we see in American society. Once it gets to be pre-America still, but on the ground of what would become the United States, in the 1660s, we see the concept of race as nationality and ethnicity starting to become about the subspecies of humanity. And we see an effort to justify chattel slavery by rewriting and reconstructing the race concepts and the language associated with race. So that's really when white, black, free person of color, these terms start to be wrapped into the concept of race. And I think one misconception people have is that Europeans saw Africans or saw indigenous people and said, automatically inferior. That wasn't actually the reality. What actually happened was they were already, for all intents and purposes, enslaving their own people, right? They had
right.
indentured servitude, and that carried over. Those indentured servants were also on the grounds that would become the United States. So the rules were just different. And they saw an opportunity, though, to stop really doing that to their own population, because they saw how that could erupt in some sort of civil war. Some sort of coup would happen, because if they were to keep indenturing their own people at the scale that was needed to their minds to achieve the political and economic success and status that they were desiring, because they saw the Americas really as the gold mine that it is. It was just not practical. So it was more practical to enslave these other people. And the justifications for it, the language of inferiority, superiority, came after the fact as an attempt to justify it. You have people like Barbara and Karen Fields, a historian and sociologist, in their book Racecraft, explain this. But even if you go back to the time period, I want to say it's an 1857 publication by Martin Delaney that people can access for free on Gutenberg. He was a free African, and he wrote a book about the condition of what he called colored people in America. And he explores how indeed this language of inferiority gets written onto people because of the need and the practicalness of enslaving people who don't look like you. And that is something that happens here increasingly from 1660 all the way until this point, because at some point, the people who were being enslaved, or the people who were living in what then becomes America, adopt the language, and it's infiltrated in every sphere. You have travel narratives theorizing about race and race language in these ways. You have scientists, doctors trying to prove the inferiority, the biological inferiority of certain groups of people, and elevate the status of other groups of people. And you have poets and playwrights, theorizing and including race and race language in their works so that it reaches the masses. You have preachers and priests preaching in a particular way to justify the enslavement of people who look a particular way, so that the popular discourse becomes infused with the ideology that is going to most benefit a very small percentage of people. But it pretended to benefit all white people, right? And it pretended to disadvantage all Black people, when in reality, I would say the majority of racialized white people weren't slave owners, weren't rich or wealthy, didn't necessarily benefit from the system. And similarly, we tend to conceive of all racialized Black people at that time period as being enslaved, when that just wasn't reality. We had Africans over here with indigenous people before Europeans came over, and that traveling continued when Europeans were still here. They were free Africans. That's why there was an entire category for them called free people of color. And it was just way more complex than what we think of it. But the problem comes around abolition time period, when people start to take the language and still trying to reconstruct it to be more positive. So you have the Frederick Douglasses and the Harriet Jacobs, the William Garrisons, taking that same language and saying Black is human, right? I'm a human too. Black people
like
are
there's no
human.
subspecies.
There's no subspecies.
Right.
And around the same time period, you have scientists disproving that race is something biological.
Right.
But you have other people who are clinging to race as biological because for whatever reason, it's hard for some people to let it go. Right. and every civil rights movement since that time period has been ironic, according to my study, because of the fact that racism creates race, meaning enslavement was already happening and then race gets created to try to justify it. So to my mind, racism creates race. So reconstructing race is just reconstructing racism, which is why we haven't been able to completely transcend it or reconcile.
Right. You start, it sort of reminds me of that scene from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where Sidney Poitier confronts his father and he says, the problem, Dad, is you see yourself as a colored man. And you've always seen yourself as a colored man. He said, I see myself as a man. And, so when you look at the civil rights movement, as we, look at it and talk about it and teach it, it's very Black. There's this emphasis on not just, human rights, civil rights. Like there is no such thing as race. It's an artificial construct, that it's more like this group of people need rights. And but then to your point, you're sort of continuing to solidify the notion that there's a group of people that who are separate, who are different, who are, who, have to be looked at that way, as opposed to just saying we have failed in our mission to extend civil rights to all Americans, which is a completely different statement, because that could include people who are not Black. They could include people who are just slightly tan. They could include Jews. They could include Asians. It could include literally anybody that anyone in America would decide for some reason to other, right? And
Yeah.
it's the othering. What I'm picking up on that you're describing is what seems to me, and I'm not a scholar, is sort of almost a human impulse to other, that there sort of have always throughout history been either manufactured or organic reasons or incentives, I shall say, to kind of separate or sort people to get some kind of gain, and that those patterns of othering, you kind of, people have looked for ways to like easily do it, or to convince other people that they wanted to control, that they should other, and so forth. And what I've always wondered about the United States is, ironically, we were founded by sort of two different kind of groupings of people. You have the grouping that came for religious persecution reasons, very Christian, very devout, right, to the Bible. And then you have others who came for sort of economic gain, completely different motivation, mostly Catholic, from, like whatever, but a lot of Catholic influence as well as Protestant influence, but it wasn't religious, it was economic. And I've wondered if the justifications might have been differently motivated, like, wow, the Bible, humans made in God's image. How do we justify having these indentured servants? How do we justify having people who we treat like slaves, right? That doesn't really follow, even though the Bible's full of slavery. Maybe they were, like, oh, we're persecuted. How do you then persecute others? Now you got to justify it. And then once the Declaration of Independence was written, there it is codified. There it is, like right there in black and white. All men are created equal. Yet, as you pointed out, people are already on the ground. There was an economy in place. People are already enslaving people. People are already doing some things. And you need these people to come join your country and help you fight the big oppressor of England, right? Who's oppressing everybody. And you're like, so now it's like, how do we now continue to justify having some men, meaning humans, right, in our under when we just got done saying all men are created equal? That seems to me people would double down on biological theories of race and subhuman species and things like that, because you've just said all men are created equal. Like, it's a weird irony. Am I like hitting
Yeah,
anything here?
it's the entire history of it is full of irony, because so you've touched on two philosophies of race, and so I feel like this is as good as any a segue into my work at Theory of Racelessness.
Yay. Okay, good. I did it by accident.
so um so the theory of racelessness is an alternative framework for analyzing said history, for analyzing contemporary discourse, especially and particularly as it pertains to racism. And it operates under certain core tenets.
Right.
The first is that race does not exist in nature. So there are 6 philosophies of race, 3 that speak to what a person thinks race is, and 3 that speak to what a person thinks should be done with race. And each person holds 2 of those philosophies, even without having the name for the philosophies. And one of the philosophies, the sort of default position in our society, is that race is of nature. It's biological. Theory of racelessness disproves and discounts that conclusion, because there are any credible geneticists and scientists, even in the last, as recently as the last month. I speak with geneticists because I really want to understand what are people misinterpreting, right? Like, is it real or is it not real? Race is not real in nature. Also, theory of racelessness holds the truth that race is not a social construction, and this differentiates from something you just said, which is race is a construction, and that's also a default position in American society, that race is a construction. So even though it might not be of nature, it still manifests itself in real ways. And I say, no, it doesn't. And just because people believe in it, just because people believe it exists, doesn't make it real for me as a racial skeptic.
I
And
guess when
that's,
I said construction, I was thinking more in terms of people. If you get a critical mass of people who say, I am of this race, right? And because I look X way, or I come from this kind of background, or whatever it might be, if you've got a millions of people, let's say, who are saying this is so, and they are describing themselves, that those people who aren't similarly, they're not able to describe themselves that way, and want to say, like, I disagree with you, I don't think race is real. It's real easy for that critical mass of people to say, well, you have no right to say, you have no position on this because you aren't one of us, or you don't look like us, or whatever. And so then that makes it almost seem like they have constructed race in so doing. That's what I
yeah,
was kind of
that,
getting at.
and that's what constructionists also believe. They believe that race is not real, but what upon interrogation, you come to find what they mean is race is not real biologically, it's not real in nature, but it's still real because people treat it as something that is real. So
Right.
what you're describing is true to a sort of constructionist stance. I point out the paradox of people saying at once it's not real, but then treating it like it is real, because people
Exactly.
really believe that it is, which means that people believe it is real in a constructed sort of way.
Yeah, they're like
Um,
saying the exact. They're just saying, it's not, but it is. Like this Irish lady I met once, where I said, "Do you believe in fairies?" And she said, "Oh no, of course not, but they're there." It's
that's
like,
hilarious. I want to talk to that
okay.
lady. um, so, theory of racelessness operates from the third category that speaks to what a person thinks race is, which is something called skepticism. So,
Mhm.
there's naturalism, constructionism, skepticism. Skepticism is heterodox, it's almost unheard of, almost nobody knows about it. And the people who find themselves being skeptics, it's often accidental, or they specialize in philosophies of race and they become persuaded. But skepticism is a very uncommon position, largely and primarily because in American society, we don't teach the philosophies of race. So people don't
Mhm.
realize there is an alternative. There's an
Right.
alternative to naturalism and even constructionism. As a skeptic, and this is another core tenet of theory of racelessness, I argue that everyone is raceless. So there's no, race is not real biologically, but it's real in this way. People believe in the unicorn, that doesn't make the unicorn real for me. Or people believe in the fairy, it's the fairy is still not real for me. And in operating from the position of everyone being raceless, it inspires and enables me to see people first and foremost as human beings, to see people outside of what people say is a construction of race
Right.
as deracialized. And from that point, we can translate. My friend calls this the race translator. This is one of the tools of the theory. We translate race when it appears in media and books, you name it, to figure out what is actually being said here. Because as a skeptic, I argue that race is not real, but racism is real. And
Oh, for
racism
sure.
is the belief in race for me, because race is the hierarchy. So it is racism. And in that way, every person can be racist, and most people are, because they believe in race as something of nature or as a construction. I just
Mhm.
don't assign a moral judgment or value to that. And the good news is, when you teach people alternative philosophies of race, and when you treat people like the human beings that they are, and when you see them outside of the box racism creates for every single one of us, then you can start to have more healing, and you can be more productive in terms of identifying what is and isn't racism, and importantly, how to solve and resolve racism where it exists. Uh,
So it sounds like I'm an accidental skeptic. Like, without realizing it, because I've said, like, on this channel, for example, I've done a few videos about how, for example, the way that critical race theory, critical pedagogy rather, is used in classrooms to talk about, power and privilege dynamics and oppressor oppressed dynamics with small children. And I've talked about how this hurts all children. This hurts everyone. This not specifically hurts white children or black children, by phenotype, but this just hurts children, period. And I've tried to explain about how that works and so forth. But part of what fueled me to make those videos was that none of this is real to me. Like, I get that it's very, very real to a lot of people, but I have strived for as long as I can remember. I don't remember a time, even as a child, where I was kind of like any version of those other two. You know what I mean? I just didn't believe that. I just didn't believe it. I probably would have fit in more. And I did live in Europe for a little while, but I would have fit in more there. Whereas, like, people are people, you know? And I get so frustrated because I can't articulate that. Like you were saying, I don't have the language to explain to people what that means. And I get accused of, like, you're in denial, this, that, all the things that people tell you, you can't feel, you can't think, you can't assert because fill in the blank. And I'm like, well, you can say that all you want. I'm going to keep doing it because I can do what I want. I can say what I want. I can believe what I want. So, there it is.
Yeah, that's the irony, and something I go into detail with in my forthcoming book, which I'll have to send you the correct title because I've since changed the title.
Oh, okay.
It's now called Theory of Racelessness: A Case for Antiracism. So in my book, I talk about how whiteness has been, because of the history and the genealogy of the concept of race, whiteness has been conflated with racelessness. So something you said earlier was, it was something to the effect of, it was Sidney Poitier, right?
Yes.
That skit, I can't call it skit, the scene where he says to his father, "You see yourself as a colored man, I see myself as a man." Now, going back to even the Harlem Renaissance, so 1930s, we'll say, you have writers like Langston Hughes interpret County Cullen's assertion of, "I don't want to be a Negro poet, I want to be a poet," as, "I want to be white." And this is in Langston Hughes's The Negro Artist in the Racial Mountain. This is like the first line. He says, "I translate it as, I want to be a white poet. I want to be white." And it's an understandable translation because of the history of race and racism, but it's an unfortunate one because that means that liberation from racism is always tied to whiteness, which means that if you are not racialized as white, then you can't be free. And that's why heterodox voices like mine, you've spoken with some of my friends, Charles Love, Ada Akpala, Kimi Katiti, Adam Coleman. That's why voices like ours get dismissed and devalued and lambasted as being anti-Black. We secretly hate ourselves, or white supremacists, or things of that nature, because of the way race was perceived and conceived. It was such that racialized Black people had to think the same. They were presumed to think the same. And to some extent, it makes sense because, after all, you're trying to get out of enslavement, right? So there's
Sure.
that. So you need the majority, if not all, people to be on board with this, right? And then you have lynchings, and you have Jim Crow, and you have, physical endangerment and that reality looming right over people. So you have to, with everything you have, combat vicious racist depictions of racialized Black people. So it makes perfect sense how it unfolds in this way. But the unfortunate part is, because of how Blackness has continued to be produced and reproduced and imagined and presumed, it is such that racism keeps confining everyone, including, and probably especially, racialized Black people, to the box that racism creates for them through the category of Blackness. And
right.
that's one of the ultimate downfalls and downsides of all of this thing, because if people are sincere about what's being called anti-racism, if people are really sincere about that, then I'm calling people to action to engage with the heterodox voices, the seldom, if ever, known alternative philosophy of skepticism, to better grapple and understand with for number one, what skepticism is, what it means, because what it's not, and something you and I kind of touched on before we went live, what it's not always, it can sometimes be this, but what it's not always is a dismissal of the existence or history of racism.
Right.
Theory of racelessness, I'm saying, yeah, racism exists. That's number one. It exists.
But we don't fight
It's
it by
just,
making it essential
we
and
don't,
telling lies.
yes, and most people don't really understand or know what racism is because of how racism and the race ideology and the language of race gets packaged in our society. Most people's heads are really in the clouds with this, and well-meaning people, constructionists, even naturalists, well-meaning people, and even skeptics. Like if you learn more and decide, like, yeah, actually, I'm a racial skeptic. Awesome. Here's how you can stop upholding the same thing you say doesn't exist. Like, I don't use race language except in particular instances, and I'll put the word racialized in front, right? So I'm not making it a natural category. I'm
Right.
putting the action, the verb in front of it. Something is happening that's demarcating certain people as white or black or Asian or whatever. So there are ways to stop upholding the same thing we say we don't want to continue.
Right.
And if we can get to the place where constructionists recognize the sort of paradoxical nature of the traditional approaches, because this isn't a sweeping generalization, all constructionists do this. No, it's just that right now what's taken to be very popular and upheld as progressive or liberatory is ironically going to have the exact opposite effect. And here's why. And I wrote an entire book on it
Yes.
and my
I'm
theory.
excited to read that now. So do you think there how much do you think the people who are at the forefront of it, and I know I'm asking you for your opinion and speculate, and if you don't want to answer, I totally get it. But I feel like there are incentives for people to hang on to race. Like, so that even if you approach them with theory of racelessness or skepticism and you say, like, let me explain to you this other way of looking at it, and here's my book and so forth, that there are people who would be really aggressively resistant to even listening because they derive some kind of power or value from continuing to uphold their theory of race.
I think it's a misconception to uh, th- maybe not to think, but to assert that some people would respond sort of aggressively or defensively. I take that to mean something like defensively,
Right.
to
You're like
something like
you're
theory of
that's
racelessness.
you're just internalizing whiteness, or you have interest convergence, or you're fragile if it's a white person saying it, like a phenotypically white person saying it. You know, hey, I've learned about this thing. Like if I met someone like Joy Reid as an example, if I ever got to sit in the same room with her and said, and she hadn't heard of you or hadn't met you. And I said, hey, Joy, great book, interesting concept. I'd love for you to read this. And she read the cover or looked at it and said, no, I'm not reading that because that's this. Like, do you think that there would be people who would respond that way? I would predict that, but maybe maybe
Uh,
I'm wrong. That would be my
um,
prediction.
I think that there's a very small percentage of people who would do that. I think the voices that seem the loudest, and that seem the most um, closed off to alternative viewpoints, I find them actually more people than not to be very reasonable and to respond exceptionally well to my ideas. It helps that as an educator, I know how to talk with people. I know how to talk to people. I know how to share information. It also helps that once upon a time, I was a constructionist, reconstructionist. So something else that theory of racelessness holds true is that the belief in race needs to be eliminated. So the three philosophies of race that speak to what a person thinks should be done with, we've spoken about one, which is something called Reconstructionism. That's the default position in American society. In fact, we teach our young people, and we see increasingly that we're teaching our young people to try to reconstruct what it is to be racialized in this country. And Again, that's the irony of it seeming progressive when we've literally only ever tried to reconstruct the thing. Then there's something called conservationism. Naturalists, of course, are going to be conservationists. You can't do anything with nature except keep it. And then there's something called eliminativism. So, theory of racelessness, the word racelessness speaks to skepticism, as in all people are raceless, and it speaks to, okay, we're all raceless in reality, but other people's reality, they're buying into the unicorn. They believe that race exists in some way, shape, or form. So there's something that needs to be eliminated. And it's my assertion that to undo racism, we have to undo the belief in race, because racism is the belief in race. And part of how I do that is by correcting in some ways how people conceive of race. So giving people information about naturalism, giving people the genealogy of the fight for civil rights, and pointing out and naming the philosophies of various people. It's not a coincidence that we're talking on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And uh, I've I've been met with a very minimal amount of resistance. And of course, the more attention my work gets, the more people try to troll. But I really take it as I really take it as people trying to troll and not really being sincere in what they say. Like, I had a piece in Newsweek that was basically telling everyone you're all wrong. and there were some people who decided to be very explicit with their racism in the comments, calling me a mud and calling me this, that, and other thing. And I don't even take it as sincere. I take it as a tool, a strategy to try to shut me up, right? To get me to go cry and go back to under
But
a rock
why
or
are they
something.
doing that? I guess what I'm trying to get to the bottom of is like, if people, let's say I give people the benefit of the doubt that they sincerely want racism to end.
Yes.
Okay. Then if I put that out there, like, okay, I believe that most people mean what they say when they say we would like to eliminate racism. But then when you approach them with something like skepticism as one of their, like, here's something you really should consider, because, you've tried the constructivism thing and the reconstructionism thing. It's not really working. So what about this approach? And look at the merit, as you point out, this scientific merit in this as well, right?
Mm.
Um, and you know, you would get that, like, please go be quiet kind of response. I'm just trying to understand, like, what might be behind that?
I just think that human beings think differently. Like, that is the beauty of humanity, and we will never agree wholesale on any topic or anything.
Okay. So you don't think
And
there's,
just
like,
because,
something inside them that wants to hold on to it a little bit?
well, I think that people would do well to work to understand the emotional aspect of this. It's easy to talk just about logic, just about history, and to tie everything all together and say, logically and practically speaking, we are making errors in pursuing anti racism in this way. That's the easy part. But the hard
Right.
part for people I've come to find is understanding the emotions and the spiritualness that gets tied into the concept of race. And for people who are racialized as white, that can be especially hard because, again, whiteness and racelessness have been conflated in a lot of problematic ways.
Mhm.
And so it makes sense that many racialized white people don't feel strongly attached to their racial identity, even though people are presumed, because they're white, to be attached to their whiteness.
I
I
know.
find that that's just
I'm like,
not.
What is whiteness?" Like, I've lived 55 years, I don't even know what that would be, right? Like, it's weird. I'm not attached to it because I don't know what the frick it is.
I find more people than not are not attached to it, except for what actual literal white supremacists. And
Right.
I think that in that case, in that extreme case, it's less. We can talk about the emotional appeal for white supremacists to have the perspective that they have, but I think ultimately, whatever the emotions are, it's rooted in a sincere ignorance, a sincere lack of knowing certain information, certain histories, a lack of knowing oneself and how we're all more alike than we are different. It's just a sincere not knowing that manifests itself in something like white supremacy, which is why I don't attach a morality to it. In the opposite direction, and the opposite end of the spectrum, if we look at something like Black nationalism, Black pride, Black power, all of those things, people were labeled as Black to justify enslavement, and they fought under the banner of Blackness to render their humanity clearer to the larger nation. Right. To themselves and to each other, it was readily apparent, but to the country that they were brought to and in, it wasn't. And so it makes sense for people to take the thing, because if you are born into a society where the presumption is you're Black, and there's all kinds of literal calculations that Thomas Jefferson did to say at this, all of these calculations, you're still Black because the one drop rule. If people are born into that society, how are they going to magically come up with the idea that they don't have to accept it and they don't have to be that and that they're not that? Even if it doesn't exist in nature, and you know that and they know that, how are you supposed to magically just poof and don't see yourself under that same framework? It makes logical sense. And then the emotional appeal of it is there because everything positive gets assigned and attached to the concept of Blackness in particular, which is something I focus on just by nature of my studies. And the concept of Blackness getting conflated with culture, getting conflated with ethnicity, because people who were enslaved or descended from enslaved people don't know what their ethnicity is. So unlike Irish, Italian, English, Dutch, people racialized as white can often point to a country of origin. Racialized Black people, if they're a descendant of enslaved people, that's not the case. So Black then becomes ethnicity. And Black becomes culture. And I can say for myself personally, everything positive I saw about myself, my tenacity, my self-motivation, my ambitiousness, my overachieving spirit, my kindness, my love, my compassion, I attached it to my Blackness. And that is a very common happening for people, because you have to understand, when people go through a certain set of I hate using the word traumas because I feel like it sort of diminishes trauma in some ways if you overuse it. But when people go through certain things, it makes sense that they try to craft that thing in as positive a way as possible, because they believe it's a thing that they have to live with. They come to see it as a deep part of who they are, who their parents are, their grandparents, their great grandparents, all the way down the line.
Right.
And there's a feeling of solidarity and unity that comes along with, for a lot of people, with their racialized identities, which is important, because if you're striving toward dismantling something like racism, you need to have feelings of support, emotional support, and people backing you. And so the emotional aspect for people attached to the concepts of race, I think it makes sense. And that makes my work harder, because it's easier to give the sort of logical, historical, linear information and sort of correct course, but helping people stop conflating, like I said, everything positive with their race, for example. That's a journey. And it was a journey for myself, because early in my doctoral work, I saw myself as, I didn't have the language for it, but I was a constructionist eliminativist. I was a constructionist reconstructionist for most of my life. And then I saw through the literature and the history that people have been showing us the entire time, people who were unfortunately largely ignored, that to undo racism, we have to undo race. And once I had that language, I started shifting to eliminativism. And I cried in my mentor's office more than once, because I didn't want to let go of what I perceived to be my blackness. That wasn't, I was proud to be black, right? It was who I was. It wasn't something that, even though my logic was telling me what I knew, my
Mhm.
heart was like, I don't want that though. That's painful, actually. And
Mhm.
that's why people respond as if you're going after their core when you question some of their ideas or some of their motivations, because in their heart they
Mhm.
feel it is part of who they are, and you're trying to take that away from me. And
Right.
that's the wrong move. But the good news is, people who stay long enough and actually engage with my ideas, go to my podcasts, or people who will read my book, they come to see what I'm actually saying. And what I'm
Right.
actually saying is, who you are remains, because who you are has nothing to do with what you think is race,
Right.
right? What people see as race or racial, they're misnaming ethnicity, which exists, they're misnaming culture, which exists, they're misnaming class. There's a class aspect to this. Or they're misnaming racism hiding itself as race, which is where stereotyping and essentialization and all that comes into play. You're
Right.
misnaming things. So all I'm talking about doing and eliminating is the racism. That's it. I'm not
Right.
talking about the stuff you love about yourself.
Right.
I'm talking about the racism. And if more people can come to it, I lead with love. I think that helps me be more successful with my messaging. Um, if more people can come to it from that perspective, and if more people can really honor and acknowledge the emotional appeal that this has, and not just dismiss it as nonsensical because it doesn't make sense to them, then I think we can finally start to get somewhere. And for what it's worth, I hope you'll feel heartened to hear that people who come into my workshops, or my trainings, my
Right.
classroom, they come in with a very fixed idea of what they think about race and racism and how to fight it, or how
Mhm.
not to fight it. And
Mhm.
then they leave completely transformed for the better. And like, I can't even go back to thinking that other way because my eyes have been opened.
Right.
So the transformation happens and can happen, but hopefully something I've said has enlightened at least a little bit the emotional appeal that it does have for other people.
Sure. And I think for me, since my focus is primarily K-12, what's so painful to me is I think you never have a better opportunity to I don't even to teach racelessness than with a child, right? I mean, you've got this brand new human. They know nothing except what you teach them, right?
Exactly.
They're new here.
Yes.
And so what I keep trying to say on the channel is that we take these, essentially raceless children, because if you watch little kids who are like toddlers play together, that's how they behave, right? And all you have to do is spend 10 minutes in a room with a group of kids to see it. It's so obvious. And
Yeah.
then I feel like, and I've been working for the last week and a half with Sloan Rackmouth on fighting back against this essentialism in preschool, not just preschool in North Carolina, but preschool special needs children. And
Mm.
so we've been pushing back because it hurt. Like, we're just like, so it feels to me, and I know it's going to sound like strong language, it feels abusive to me to take a small child and as an adult to take this essentialism message and teach it to them and like frame the world that they know nothing about. They only know what's in those four walls and their family. Like, that's basically it. And maybe within a mile of their home. That's like the size of their community when you're talking about a preschooler. And that's all they know. And you frame that way, you are at the root, like you are starting with this brand new being and putting an idea in their head that is now going to be much, much, much more difficult. Of course, they're going to come to it emotionally because that's how they operate. They're pre-rational. And then the longer you reinforce it and the more you teach it to them, they're not just going to be believers, they're going to be actors in
Yeah.
the perpetuation of it. And so I'm like, I'm heartsick over it because I keep trying to, and then the pushback I get is, you're the wrong messenger of this message because you don't look right. Right.
Yeah.
And
You
I'm
know,
like, well, I hate to break it to you. You're not listening to other people who don't look like me either. It's not,
right. Yeah. You know what's interesting to me, Deb? I I hear you, and I would agree that this is not the right path forward. Clearly, I've invested my entire life's work toward actually solving, healing, reconciling around this thing called racism. And but the interesting thing to me is this strategy for anti-racism, or what's being called DEI, it's new, sort of. It's
Right.
like in its infancy in some ways. I mean, Kendi and D'Angelo's books, for example, only go back but so far. So it feels very new. But to my mind, what we're identifying as happening in schools has always been happening. And
Right.
that's part of the problem that people who are very well intentioned are trying to bring to the surface and help people understand. Because children, it's not like, so what I'm saying is, it's not like before now, children just weren't learning racism. They
Mm-hmm.
were learning racism. It just wasn't being spoken about really necessarily in helpful or meaningful ways like school, and thereby they were being actors when they became into adulthood, because they've internalized all of what they've learned through media, all of what
Right.
they've learned through their peers, through textbooks. You know, I remember being in elementary school. Now, I'm 37 years old. I turned 38 in a month or so. So I'm older. Elementary school is a long time ago for me. But I remember learning about the 5 human races, you know, and all that stuff in textbooks. And I also remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old, my adoptive mother, who was an immigrant from Panama, she told me that my adoptive father's family didn't like me because I was Black. Those were her exact words. And she said it because she was an abuser and she wanted to separate me from his family because she didn't want to be found out. And I was getting of the age where I could have conversations with people and actually tell people what was going on at my house. So she wanted to put a wedge, and that's how she chose to put the wedge. And from that point on, I then, without choice, this wasn't in school, this was with at home, I then saw myself through a particular lens. And this was compounded by the fact when I'm 12 or 13, I was a middle schooler. I'm on the school bus, and a high schooler started calling me pubic hair, and she would taunt me every day calling me pubic hair. And then one day she grabbed me by my ponytail and assaulted me. And when I got off the school bus that day at the middle school, she had to continue to the high school. And I can still hear in my mind the sound of her hawking a loogie out the window, spitting on me, and her spit landing in my hair, just hanging
Oh.
there. And I've been called the N-word. You know, my brother through the adoption was shot at by a skinhead. We lived in a trailer park, and there was somebody who was older than us who was apparently a skinhead. He was kicked out of the trailer park and everything. It was a whole thing. And so I've experienced the worst of people, both because of my adopted mother abusing me, but then also because of how I learned about my race. I learned about it because of an example of racism, which is part of my evidence for how racism hides itself as race. And I learned about it because of being assaulted and being both verbally and physically assaulted, right, throughout the
Right.
years. And the the harder part, I think, or the part that also complicates this, is also in elementary school. I remember being in school and reading about the period of slavery and feeling my face turn red because I was at a primarily racialized white school, and all of my classmates, I could feel the discomfort. And maybe I was projecting the discomfort onto them, but I just remember a few of my classmates would always kind of look back at me, and the messaging was clear that I was different, that I was like the people that were enslaved that we're reading about, and it was just really uncomfortable. And so I say that to say what's happening now isn't new, because we still teach and learn racism from the time we're very young for
Mhm.
various reasons and in different ways. But where I do concede is that we've always been doing it wrong. we've
Yeah.
always been
Oh, I
insufficient
agree. I
because
agree. And I understand the impetus to get out ahead of it and talk to kids and sort of begin to, prevent some of the things that happen to you. I mean, if well-intentioned people want to protect small children from the kind of traumas, very real traumas that you suffered, like no child should have to deal with, and it may still happen, but if schools can take some kind of initiative and try to get ahead of that, or at least shore up the confidence in the child who might be on the receiving end of it, these are all good intentions.
right,
And they're not wrong. That's why I said at the beginning, like, they're not wrong that these things do go on. They happen every day. They've happened for generations. This is not new. It's just that, how we then talk about it, how we bring this up to children, how we empower them, how we, I want to make sure we're not accidentally disempowering them and leaving them feeling a sense of learned helplessness rather than a true sense of confidence and empowerment in their own humanity. Or, there's disempowerment and then there's accidentally encouraging them to feel animus, preemptive animus or cognitive distortion. Like, I see someone who looks different from me, I automatically am looking on the defensive, like, what are they going to do? Right. So these are all things that we have to be careful and responsible as adults in charge of young minds, that we take our good intentions and we think about the potential. We're never going to fix it perfectly, but we think about the potential negative unintended consequences of the ways that we talk about these things with them. I'm certainly not suggesting we pretend everything's fine, this never happens. Like, just because little bitty toddlers are sort of raceless, they don't live in a vacuum either. They're going to leave their little 1 mile radius. They're going to go to preschool. They're going to go to school. They're going to be around adults we don't know. They're going to come in contact with the public. And so I see the value in kind of getting ahead of that to help them. And if somebody had been able to help you and kind of get out ahead of that, to, it still might have happened, but maybe you could have explained it to yourself differently, so that it had less of a negative impact on your heart and your soul and your, and your self-concept. But we have to be just so flippin' careful, I think. It's a big responsibility, is I guess what I'm saying.
it's a big responsibility and a complicated problem and a complicated history. And
Right.
I think at the root of what we see happening now, it really goes back to the fact that alternatives have not been presented, but also to a certain extent haven't even existed.
Yeah.
I didn't create theory of racelessness. I can't say that I didn't create it on purpose. I did, but I had no way of imagining the global reach and impact anything I said would have on people, especially so quickly. And it's overwhelming and surreal because people don't generally just walk around making theories. For it to be a theory, it has substance to it. There's a
Yeah.
framework. There's a way. There are core tenets, just like the other theory that's
Mhm.
circulating out there that we're talking about, critical race theory, right? There are core tenets. There are tools that people can use, and I don't take that responsibility lightly. I don't take any of it lightly because ultimately I see how people, regardless of their political leanings, are I feel like people are ready for something else. And people are just at a loss because they genuinely believe that there's no other better way to do it. They feel like, okay, well, we could go back to doing what we did pre anti racism or pre what's being called DEI, but that was insufficient. And we know
Mhm.
that because racism still exists.
Sure.
So that's insufficient. So we got to solve it. So here's the solve. And then you have people saying, wait, that's not the solution. We
Right.
don't necessarily think that we should just go back to not really being proactive and
Exactly.
doing anything. And we acknowledge that racism can happen or it does happen, but this isn't it. And then
Right.
people are at a draw because they're like, well, it's either essentially what people are translating, do nothing or do this. And this
Right.
seems more evil to some people, right? And doing nothing seems more evil to other people.
Right.
And I'm raising my
You're like,
hand like,
"Hi, here I am."
like I have a
So,
solution.
to that end, let me ask you a couple of questions that are kind of rattling in my mind. So, I noticed that you use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion in your vocabulary. Can
Yes.
you define what those words mean to you in Theory of Racelessness?
Yeah, so I have to meet to a certain extent. I have to meet people where they are. So I that's the space I'm in because I'm doing anti-racist work. And I look at anti-racism as everything that came before Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He might have I don't even know, want to misspeak and say that he coined that term, but he definitely brought that term into the public sphere in a way that we cannot seem to change. But anti-racism, to my mind, has been in existence since the period of slavery, right? It's the people who were literally fighting against the system of racism. So I call it DEI because that's becomes synonymous with anti-racist work, and anti-racist work is what I do.
Right.
And I've
You're still
coined.
fighting racism. You're just
That's right.
doing it in a way that is not saying, for example, the only way to do it is to reverse discriminate. Because
No,
because that's pretty much he says, current discrimination is the only
insult
antidote
with
to
more
past.
discrimination. Yes,
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
So my work is distinctly different from what's being accepted or taken as the right path forward, and
Mhm.
that's why so many people find a home with theory of racelessness. It's also important for me to mention that it's a nonpartisan effort. So unlike most of the discourse around topics of racism, which are often very partisan and very political, that's not what this is, which is why I talk with anyone and everyone about my ideas and about the theory. And it's why I'm sincere in my efforts, because it's not about politics for me. It's literally about helping people heal from the internalization of racism, which can happen,
Mhm.
which something you said earlier resonates on this point, because part of the internalization, to be clear, is the detrimental impact it has on a person's being when they experience somebody else's ignorance. And that continues to be a side effect, or yeah, a side effect, an outcome of racism, because of the way we frame it. Because
Mhm.
right now we're framing it from a constructionist, reconstructionist position. So all of us are in the box. We're all racialized. We racialize ourselves, we racialize each other. And
Right.
because we're looking at it in that way, we tend to talk about racism in the language of race. That's the problem that you're seeing play out in primary schools and K through 12.
Well, it's so easy to just do because you can look at people, right? You'd be like, well, you're this and you're that. I mean, it almost feels kind of lazy sometimes because you don't, if you can see it, you can talk about it, right? And that doesn't make something true. I
Yeah.
guess is because what I'm noticing is no, I don't see anybody asking the question, well, what is your definition of black? Or what is your definition of white? Or what is your definition of color? Yet these words are finding their way into curricula. They're finding their way into lesson plans. They're finding their way into things that we're paying millions of dollars for teacher training. And they'll use these terms. And I'm waiting to see somebody have their hand go up and go, I need a definition here because are you literally taking a paint chip, a Pantone strip? Like how are you defining these human beings as of color or as black or as white? And when this, so it just feels kind of like shorthand and nobody's questioning it.
Because people have not been presented with an alternative way of doing this work. And because racism hides itself as race along with just about everything else under the sun,
Mhm.
race we're misdirecting discourse away from racism and talking about it in the language of race, which then helps us unintentionally usually uphold the problem of racism. So through my efforts, I'm saying let's redirect the
Right.
discourse to the actual root of the problem. Let's not uphold the symptom of the problem, the symptom being race itself as people believe it exists. Let's
Sure.
not uphold it with the argument of, oh well, society does it to me, I don't have a choice or whatever. Let's not use those arguments as excuses to continue to
Right.
uphold the problem. We can do this a different way. So I want you to consider yourself to be raceless in my workshop or my class, right? you are raceless, you're deracialized. And now let's analyze what race is doing in different contexts. Let's look at the history. And let's be more precise and translate race into more precise terms. Is what's happening in this book, is it culture that's being pointed to? And then if it's culture, how is culture tied to race? Does every racialized white person have the same culture? Does every racialized Black person have the same culture? If not, then why are we assigning race to culture, and why are we conflating it? And let's talk about how that's problematic, because since the beginning of time, people racialized in the same way across any category have never been the same, have never spoken the same language, lived in the same nation, worn the same clothes. I could go to Texas and meet people racialized as Black who are going to be, and I've lived in Houston. I got my MA from the University of Houston, so I've been in Texas. The culture there is very different from the culture being in New York State, or being in California where I've lived, or even being in DC where I've lived. So is culture racial? Does race produce culture, or does culture produce race? These are the things that we have to disentangle. And if if race appears and we see it as being ethnicity, let's talk about ethnicity. Let's define it. How many ethnicities are there? Well, we can't say that there are countless ethnicities, because if somebody was patient enough, they could count them. But there are thousands, at least, of ethnicities, but there are 5 races. Does that make any sense to you? And let's talk about race as something biological. What do you mean? And then people will bring up something like sickle cell. Well, that's not racial. That's not a Black disease. People who live in or people who descend from sub-Saharan Africa, or particular types of climates, are more predisposed to it. And even then, it's a very small percentage of usually African Americans who actually have it. So how is that a Black disease, right? Or,
so you're asking questions. Like, what I love about this, remember I just said I don't hear people asking questions. It sounds like you're doing is you're just taking people where they are and starting to nudge them gently and lovingly towards asking the questions that we all need to be asking to better understand how these things play in our lives, how our self-concept is developed, to, as the word is the critical theory, interrogate that, like to say like, wait, does that really make sense? Or am I oversimplifying? Am I just latching onto something because it feels good, or because I don't have another option? So this kind of critical thinking, with a real kind of critical thinking, what I would call it, where you're sort of just poking holes in subconscious arguments that I think a lot of us walk around having conversations with ourselves we don't even realize we're having, holding beliefs we don't realize we have. And it takes someone coming along to teach us. That's why you're an educator, so I can see that. And what you're doing is what teachers should be doing. And I would love to see this translated down to like kindergarten, like to begin to ask those questions, to at least put the questions out there, because not every student is going to answer it right away or agree right away. But if you never have the question posed to you, you don't even have the opportunity to answer it for yourself or others. Like, maybe you have to hear the question 7, 8, 9 times. But the point is, we've got to start somewhere of saying like, but what about this? But what about the fact of biology? What about this historical reality? What about these, incentives that you haven't looked at, and so forth? And maybe even being self-aware of like, what might the belief in this be doing for you that you're not even aware of, that you don't need? Like, you don't need this. You may think you need this, but what if you didn't need it? What if you had the power to do what it is you want to do without this belief? Those kinds of questions. That's teaching.
Yeah, my students often come away with a mantra: question everything.
Yes.
And that's a critical part of my work, because of course I have certain knowledge and beliefs, right? But I think as an educator, the best thing I can do is to ask questions that aren't generally being asked and that they're not going to hear anywhere else. And my students will tell me, I literally learn the exact opposite everywhere else. And then I come to your class and you're saying these things. And at first I think you're crazy. And then I listen more. And then the more I listen, the more I realize that you're just spitting facts. That's quoting one of my
Yeah.
favorite students. Not that I have favorites, but I have favorites.
But I do.
So yeah, and I love that. And at the end of the semester for my college students, it culminates in some sort of creative output, and I want them to say in an artist statement, how does this creative output connect with the concepts and the ideas that you learned in the class? And people, if you find me on Twitter, Sheena Mason, Ph.D., I share their artwork there, and they're doing collages with the word human, and the word human is using book cover art from all the books that we read, and in the background it's all the like racialized terms and language. And one student did I think it was colored pencil, and one side was black and white, and it was talking about, you know, like privileged. It had the American flag, but it was black and white, and she wrote guilt, shame, all those kinds of things. And then the other side was completely colorful, question everything was there, eliminativism was there. And she did a chain, and she like broke the chain by literally putting a hole in the paper. Like it was so dope. My students never disappoint with their art projects. But that to me is evidence of how this type of framework can actually, number one, be a space for learning for every student, right? It's not me saying what many of them might already think, and it's definitely not me saying what's already being taught to them in other classes. Okay, this is very different for them. And the same is true for people who come to my workshops or trainings, or I do a lot of conferences and speaking events. I'm giving information that unfortunately people are not privy to, for reasons like there are certain people who do absolutely benefit in more ways than one, including financial, from the continuation of this myth. Right? There are people who benefit from that, but the people who actually benefit, such a small minority of people. It just is made and packaged to make it seem like all white people benefit, right? Or all black people are disadvantaged. And that to me is racism having its way with us, because one thing I think is really important. And when I watched your conversation with Charles Love, it made me think of a mind-blowing moment I had with him myself when I spoke with him on my channel. And it's really because racism is packaged in this way that we are precluded more often than not from seeing what it actually is. And that to me is a meaningful breakthrough for people to have too, because if 19.5% of racialized Black people in 2020 lived below the poverty line, 19.5% in 2020 during the pandemic, at least the pandemic had started, right, lived below the poverty line, then why are people who lean left and people who lean right basically talking about Black people as if they're all poor? But you know, if you lean left, you blame it on the system of racism, and if you lean right, you blame it on the inferior culture because we racialize culture. 19.5% is not the majority, right?
And then there are those of us who blame it on the politics. It's like I come along and I'm like, I blame it on the government. But anyway, so
there are so many. The myth extends beyond race because of the fact that we buy into and subscribe the idea of race, and we talk about the problem in the language of race, so that Blackness is perceived to be synonymous with poverty and being poor, being violent. And Charles Love in his book dispels that notion very well and efficiently, I think, by pointing out that 2.5% of racialized Black people commit violent crimes. But if you talk about it in other language, then it's going to sound like all Black people or the majority of Black people are violent. But that's just not true. But because we talk about our problems in this country through that language, we are less equipped and less able to be more astute in identifying what is what anymore. And
the whole way it's, like you said, the whole way it's packaged, the whole way everything is framed. And at this point, it's become so political.
Yes.
That it's almost I would say it is impossible at this point for adults, certainly, to separate that out. It's kind of like if you even want to ask some of these questions, people make assumptions about your politics.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so you're like, why are you assuming that? I'm just asking questions.
Right.
So it's so hard to have conversations. And then people's like, we need to have difficult conversations. I'm like, I'm not seeing that. I'm not, because the real difficult conversation it would include a lot more questions and a lot less lecturing.
That's right. And coming from a person who I have the capacity to lecture, get on my soapbox, because I have knowledge that other people aren't privy to, so I feel an obligation to share my knowledge.
Sure,
But
of
at the
course.
same time, I lead my college classes, for example, with questions from students. I have them do what I call discussion starters. So every day, 3 or 4 students come in with 3 to 4 well-conceived discussion questions, and that's the entire class period, is me talking with the students about their questions. So it's me asking questions, and it's the students asking questions and answering each other's questions, and then me chiming in where I see maybe fruitful opportunities to add or elevate the discourse. And I come from 9th through 12th grade background because I'm a Teach for America Corps member. I was in Houston. I was at what was called a last chance charter school. I worked with 9th through 12th graders doing ELA, English Language Arts, and I was also the supervisor for English as a second language. I was the supervisor and coach for all of the other teachers, and I monitored the progress of ESL students in our school. And the strategies that I use in college are the strategies I use with high schoolers. And I taught a college level course for college credit to high schoolers in the Mississippi Delta through Freedom Summer Collegiate, an organization I'm on the teacher advisory board for. And that first class I taught with them in 2018 was a class called Which Came First, Race or Racism? And it was a philosophy of race course. And we looked at the different philosophies of race in the literary text and
Right.
in historical, and then we looked at the historical record. So there's definitely more fruitful ways to do this. I think that some people are misguided when they say things like, oh, an English class isn't a place to talk about these things or whatever, that's where we're supposed to teach reading. Well, yes, and you can also have these meaningful conversations because it's in the literature. So if we're
Sure.
teaching literature, then we are dabbling in philosophy, we're dabbling in political science and cultural studies, the entire thing, which is a good
I think
thing.
people are getting confused between wanting so desperately to get rid of the racial essentialism and, wanting to not throw the cannon out the window, wanting to, allow kids to engage with really challenging texts. So there's like multiple moving parts here, things that are happening simultaneously. And I think people tend to overgeneralize because they don't spend all day like you do, or even like I do, like, waiting around and all the stuff. So they hear that they're talking about race, for example, in English class, and the immediate assumption, and it's not always wrong, is they're using a specifically chosen text to push a worldview of race or a theory of race, as opposed to let's look at how this piece of literature informs us about it, right? And
Hmm.
actually ask questions and pull from the students. There's more of a sense of, let me tell you what this means, right?
Yeah, I think that's detrimental to any person learning, and that's part of the reason why when people come into adulthood they can be so stubborn in some ways and closed-minded to other ideas and knowledge, because they've been taught in some ways how to think, or
Right.
what to think, not even how to think, what to think. And I think that the distinction matters. And I
Right.
kind of am aligned with Charles Love in the sense that he's like, okay, if you're going to teach something like the 1619 Project, include something like his book Race Crazy, right?
Sure.
Because then at least we can have a more honest or more fuller conversation about what's the material that's being presented, as opposed to it being so one-sided in a way, and therefore it's not being problematized or questioned.
Right.
And I think that teaching people, giving people more tools and alternative frameworks helps with helping people also question everything and feel comfort in questioning everything. Now, my students and my clients are not necessarily safe everywhere questioning everything, because that is not the culture that we have created in our society for ourselves. But I think if we do approach what can be difficult conversations or uncomfortable conversations, really seeing and recognizing each other's humanity first and foremost, and also having come to the table with a better understanding of what emotions might be influencing people, and not always, because I think people talk about the emotional aspect, but they tend to focus only on the negatives that they perceive. Like it's hate or it's, it's anger. And I'm like, there are other emotions, right? That like
Pride,
pride,
it's
fear,
yeah,
love,
yeah, exactly.
and those emotions, even if they don't resonate with you for various reasons, they are still very real for that person.
Sure.
And sometimes I think it has, most times I think it actually has nothing to do with hate, and everything to do with all of the other
Belonging. There's a
oh
lot
my
of lip
gosh.
service given to
Yes.
belonging, but we know all you have to do is open your eyes, and especially children, and especially from middle school on children, there is an intense drive to feel like you belong in
Yes.
something. And then if
Yes.
you have fragmented families or you have an increasingly polarized society and you don't have the same degree of just walk out my front door and there's my neighbors and we just all chit chat or whatever, they're searching for something that is a basic human need, fellowship. And then,
Yes.
of course, if you don't have religion or you don't have a place where you literally go each week for fellowship, and I'm not, advocating one or the other, I'm just saying that these were some of the things, the structures and institutions that we've had in the past, not just in this country, but in Western society in general, that have kind of like disintegrated because of the tools of modern life and
Yep.
mobility and different things. But human beings have not evolved accordingly. We don't evolve as fast as technology does. We don't evolve as fast as even our culture does. And so what you are left with is actual humans with a real human need for that. And you can't really fault them for saying, okay, I will have fellowship with this, and
Right.
especially if somebody's going, yes, you should.
Yes.
It
Yes.
why wouldn't you?
Yep. So this speaks to the psychological aspect of all of this, because a lot of it, if we're talking about emotions, especially, that to me rings psychology. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Carlos Hoyt, but
No.
he did a wonderful TED talk. I encourage people to look up Carlos Hoyt's TED talk.
Okay.
And he's the author of a book called The Arc of a Bad Idea. And we recently did a podcast on my channel and basically fell in love with each other. Platonic, of course. We fell in love with each other, and we're collaborating because he's a licensed social worker and licensed psychotherapist, and he's um, deep into what's called DEI, and he's very experienced, and he works primarily with children. And he does this one exercise. He does this with any age group, but he does this one exercise that I imagine has to be very effective for children, where he'll have 3 spice containers and he'll have a substance in each container. 2 of the substances will be white and 1 will be brown. And he'll hold up the containers and he'll ask the participants, you know, tell me what you see. Like describe the containers, the substances. Tell me what you see. And so they'll give all kinds of answers, and then he'll ask which 2 of these substances are more alike. And almost inevitably, people presume the white substances are more alike, and children fall into that trap, if you will. And then he'll ask why, right? So he'll solicit answers in terms of how people are thinking about a thing being more alike than other seemingly dissimilar things. And then he'll say, 1 is white sugar, 1 is brown sugar, and 1 is salt. So the 2 more alike are the brown sugar and the white sugar. And then he'll talk through that, like, what does it mean for these 2 things to be more alike? What's the difference between the 2, brown sugar and white sugar? There's one difference, it's molasses. And then he compares that to race, There's one difference, it's melanin, right? And so he
Wow.
talks through all of these things, and I'm like, man, as we're talking about K through 12, I'm thinking about the power of that, for any age group,
Even
right?
for just learning science, because the first lesson
Yes.
we would teach in elementary school about science, I used to have this foam rock. Okay. And I would, in my first and second grade classes, we would do anything science related. The first day I'd walk in, I would just like throw the rock. I knew it wasn't going to hurt anybody, right? And they'd be like, ah, and like scatter to the four winds, right? And then it would bounce, of course. And they would go, what? And they'd go pick it up. And we'd begin the conversation about observation. And why did you run? And what was your belief about this thing? And why did you think that? Well, it looked this way. Okay. Is that all you need to know what it looked like? And so
Mm,
then I would pass it around and they'd say, okay, now use your hands, use, see, I don't want you to taste it, but smell it, listen to it. Like, to teach them about using your five senses to engage with reality and engage with the world, to start them down the path of skepticism that
yes.
I can't just go by this, or whatever,
Right.
because that's really the first lesson that children need to learn about science is I have to understand observation.
I love
And that,
that.
so it was just like a little ticket. I learned it in graduate school. It wasn't my invention, but our teacher showed us that. And I said, I'm using this. This is awesome.
This is
Right. Cause that's what we
brilliant.
do. We copy what works, but it was
Yes.
such a great conversation. And then we did paper bag exercises where you put materials and they'd be blindfolded and like, tell me what you think it is, write it down based on your other senses, go blind and see what happens. And these kinds of exercises, once you start teaching children how to think, that's critical thinking, how
Hmm.
to do that, you're teaching them a life skill. It's so important. So whether they're engaging with the conversation about race or science or history or anything, their go-to is going to be, what do I know? How do I know that I know it? And how do I test that?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I
I
love
love
it.
this. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so crucial. And it seems so like, duh, that makes sense. And
Yeah.
yet we know that this is not how the conversation is necessarily being done. It might, maybe in
Right.
some places, but I think in large part that's not how we're doing it. We have never tried skepticism as it pertains to race, and we have never tried eliminativism as it pertains to race.
Right.
But we have tried constructionism, naturalism, and reconstructionism, and we've been doing that for centuries. And how's that working for us? And
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
part of our evidence is because of how increasingly polarized the country has become.
Yeah.
There's always been some polarity,
Right.
always,
Yeah.
across different topics and especially politics, but I think we're at a time period now where we are on the threshold of either really deepening the divides in a way that we will regret, or we have the option to choose the different path
Right.
and start to do the thing that most of us say we want, which is we want healing, we want reconciliation, we want mutual understanding and mutual respect, all of these things, right? And so when I think of the power of doing those kinds of exercises, and when I think of the power of gifting that way of questioning everything, and pursuing lines of inquiry to
Mhm.
their very ends, to
Yeah.
our children, I think that ultimately makes our society, our nation better.
I so
And that
agree.
is the future I want for, I have 2-year-old triplets. That's the future I want for my babies. That's the future I want for my grandbabies. Like,
Yeah.
I want it for your family, and everyone listening. I want that. And the good news
Exactly.
is, I think some of the pessimism or cynicism can come into play because I think we convince ourselves that everyone just has to agree, right? So
Yeah.
the people on the extreme opposite ends of the spectrums, the polls, they've got to somehow come closer to the center. But the reality is, we just need the statistical majority. And I
Yeah.
think the statistical majority of Americans are over it, are ready for something different, as so long as it's beneficial and positive and generative.
Right.
And there's no time like the present. So
Right.
come
I
into Theory
agree.
of Racelessness.
Yes, please do. And you're going to have to keep us posted on the book so I can like broadcast it out as well. Before we go, real quick, couple of practical questions because I get this, and I was actually going to go from here to my locals community to do a little show because it is MLK Day. I've been asked, what are some constructive ways I have a lot of homeschoolers, and my Monday show is always about homeschool, and how can, other than the wonderful experiment you just described, which I won't be able to do justice, so I'll send people over to this show and recommend the book again, which is, for those listening, that Carlos Hoyt, is that Hoyt?
Yes.
Okay. Arc of a Bad Idea. It may not be discussed in there, but I just want to read what he has to say. But what would you suggest to my locals members, for example, who are homeschooling their kids and they want to do a better job, but they haven't yet gone to one of your seminars? They don't know anything about it. Like, what kinds of things can they read? What could they do with their kids to begin, having these kinds, having them learn about theory of racelessness?
Yeah, I mean, the theory of racelessness, as it is my conception, is something that people can learn more about by going to my podcast. I have a growing library of thought there.
Okay.
It takes anything worth having doesn't come easy, right? Is that the saying? Something like that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So if you put in the time and listen to some of my podcasts, that would be helpful. Of course, my forthcoming book, Theory of Racelessness, that's the entire subject of the book. So
Will do.
but I'm anticipating that maybe coming out in the summer. Palgrave MacMillan is a publisher. They're a publisher of mostly scholarly texts. So it is scholarly, but I've created the introduction and conclusion to be palatable for a general, broader audience, to show the applicability of this thing outside of the focus of the book, which is really philosophy and literary studies. But in addition to that, I would just say, and this is advice that I try to pass on to anyone who listens to me: find a way to expose yourself to voices that you don't agree with, or to voices that you think you don't agree with. Find a way to expose yourself to that. Now, the algorithm sets us all up to stay in our thought chambers, right? It sets us all up. It sets us up to be engaged with voices that we're likely to agree with, right? But there's a way to beat the algorithm by finding just as many voices that you contend with, because ultimately, and listening to them, wholeheartedly listening to them, because ultimately part of what's impeding all of us from moving forward together in a more fruitful way is our unwillingness or inability to engage meaningfully with the other side, whoever the other side is perceived to be. And in doing that for myself and engaging with a plethora of voices, regardless of, their politics or how they identify, I've been able to expand my thinking infinitely.
Right.
And if nothing else, that doesn't necessarily change my own viewpoints about certain things, right? But I don't fear changing my viewpoints, because I recognize that I could be wrong about anything, right?
Right.
And that's
But at the
also
same time, you understand that your convictions are derived from thoughtful consideration, reason,
oh yeah,
science, So in other words, that you went through the process of concluding what you've concluded by, questioning yourself over and over, and that sort of thing. Whereas a lot of us, myself included in the past and so forth, weren't aware of the number of opinions we held and the number of values and so forth that we're just kind of walking around with, that we didn't come by quite that honestly, that we
yeah,
learned in childhood, that we're just kind of, I use the word indoctrinated into us
yep,
because we heard them so many times, or we didn't ever think that they were necessary to question. So I've told people even on the channel, I'm like, let's face it, when you're a small child and somebody is telling you about things that are not objective fact, like they're not going, this is a pair of eyeglasses, okay? They're saying, the Americans were oppressed by the British and we fought a revolution to be free, or so, okay? So there's some value judgments in there, right? No, I think they can be borne out with evidence and explained in a little better way. But if you're a small child and you're presented with that as a fact, that's what you know. That technically is indoctrination, because until such time as that child has the vocabulary and the background knowledge to interrogate that, to say like, well, define freedom and define oppression, and like, was that really? And and they may still arrive at the same conclusion. But if
right.
they didn't do it, if they didn't arrive at it, it was indoctrination. That's literally the definition.
Yeah, and that's the hard part because people say, well, there's no excuse. Many people say there's no excuse to not know anything now, right? Because we have so much access to technology and access to information. But the hard part is if we are not, you don't know what you don't know. So if we
Correct.
are not exposing ourselves to all of the voices, then we are doing ourselves a disservice. You don't do it for other people, you do it for yourself. And
Right.
if you're confident in your ideas, then you should be willing to engage with
Yes.
other viewpoints. And it's okay to be wrong. It
Yeah.
happens to all of us. Uh, and it's okay to grow your thoughts.
Right.
And it's okay to it's okay to disagree and to think differently about different aspects of things.
Yep.
That shouldn't be the deal breaker.
No.
But I think what is very concerning, and what I hear from you and what I hear from plenty of people and what I see happening for myself, it is that there's this very fixed way that people have in mind to deal with the problem of racism and its history that I think hurts all of us. It hurts
Yeah.
all of us. And it doesn't matter that it's well intentioned, it hurts. The outcome matters here. And the good news is we have alternatives now. Maybe we didn't have alternatives in the past. I only just created Theory of Racelessness, but we have alternatives now.
Okay. I'm so like I'm so excited to read your book, even if it is scholarly. Like I'll read, the beginning, then I'll see what I can do in the middle part. But we have my friend Adrienne Wooten, who's in the chat right now, who is a scientist actually, and she has a channel called Shia Sophia, and she takes studies and kind of dissects them and like helps translate for the little people. Like so maybe she'll read it too, and like maybe we can like share thoughts on it so we can help others who are lay people. But this conversation has really cheered me up a lot because, well, A, I learned a ton. So thank you. I hope the audience did as well. B, I feel so hopeful because I feel like with you out there doing this work and educating other people, and I hope that your voice gets louder, and I hope more people amplify it. I hope I'm just like the smallest rung on this ladder. I hope other bigger voices pick it up because this is novel for probably 99% of people. They have not heard this approach, just even skepticism. I'm sure there will be people who are resistant, but the more we talk about it, the more it will become an other option. And certainly for my community, I will go off here now and I will start talking. I'll talk this up. Whatever I was going to talk about before it goes by the wayside, because this is, I think, what people need to know. But I can't thank you enough for spending this time with us and really giving us an education about these issues. So thank you so much. And we are going to be looking for your book as
Thank
well.
you. Thank
So,
you. Thank
and
you,
how,
Deb.
tell me how, aside from on Twitter, is this correct? This is your Twitter at Sheena Mason,
Yes.
PhD. Okay.
Yes.
And you have the podcast. Where can they find the podcast? Like Spotify everywhere, or are there specific places?
I primarily, by primarily, right now I only upload to YouTube, even though I
Okay.
have a placeholder on other um, platforms. I just haven't uploaded them. So YouTube is the
Okay.
best way to find me.
And the channel is called.
If you search Sheena Mason in the YouTube search box, my channel will pop up. You can't miss it.
Okay, great. So just search on the name, find the YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube, share it, make sure you get the word out. The more people start to understand that, like, hey, it's another way. And I understand that you didn't do this work or create any of this as an alternative, but it just so happens that it is. I think, so people can do with that what they will. But even if you're just educating yourself, I think this is, you mentioned on your website that when people start to look at things this way, there's a sense of feeling unburdened and feeling lighter and liberated and kind of free. And I couldn't agree with you more. I can't think of anything more liberating than just saying, yeah, that just doesn't apply. And I'm gonna look at people as people. And it's not easy. Like there's a difference, but freedom isn't easy. But just getting rid of that is already like a big weight. It's like you just cast off this like lead suit. And I definitely feel that way. I've tried to encourage people to do that before I even met you and had a vocabulary for it, but I can promise you I'm going to do it even more now. So
I'm glad I can
I
help.
promise with that. So I thank you so much, Dr. Sheena Mason. And I hope everybody has a great day. Please go follow her on all the platforms and spread the word. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.